She was born royal, but her blood was already poisoned at 15. She was forced to marry her own uncle by 21. She was dead, pregnant, broken, and quietly erased. Her face hangs in museums. Her life was a warning no one listened to. This isn't medieval gossip. This is what happens when power values bloodlines more than human lives. Tonight, you're about to hear the true story of Margaret Theresa of Spain, a girl trapped inside an empire that consumed its own children. And once you understand what her family did, you'll never look at royalty the same way again. Long before Margaret Theresa of Spain was born, her fate had already been written, not by prophecy, not by God, but by blood, for centuries. The House of Habsburg ruled Europe with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. Their banners flew over Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, and territories scattered across the globe. To their enemies, they seemed unstoppable. To their subjects, eternal. To history, they would become something else entirely, a dynasty that slowly destroyed itself from the inside. The Habsburgs did not build their empire primarily through war. They built it through marriage, a marriage to secure a throne, a marriage to absorb a kingdom, a marriage to prevent power from ever leaving the family. Their unofficial motto said it all. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. At first, it worked brilliantly. Lands were inherited instead of conquered. Crowns passed quietly from father to son, uncle to nephew, cousin to cousin. The Habsburg name became synonymous with legitimacy. If you ruled, chances were you shared their blood, or wished you did. But as generations passed, that strategy hardened into obsession. Outsiders were no longer trusted. Foreign blood was seen as a threat. Slowly, deliberately, the family began turning inward. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Aunts married nephews. Each union was approved by the church, justified by politics, and celebrated by courts across Europe. No one spoke publicly about the cost. Children were born weak. Some never spoke. Others never walked. Many never survived infancy. Those who lived often carried visible signs of decay, malformed jaws, fragile bodies, chronic illness, and minds that failed long before their time. Still, the marriages continued. By the 17th century, the Habsburg family tree no longer branched outward. It folded in on itself, and at the center of this tightening circle sat Spain, the crown jewel of the dynasty. When Philip IV ascended the Spanish throne in 1621, he inherited not only an empire, but a tradition that demanded sacrifice in the name of continuity. Philip was young, charismatic, deeply religious, and utterly convinced that God had chosen his family to rule. Spain, under his reign, stretched across Central and South America, the Caribbean, the Philippines, and far beyond Europe's borders. To the world, he was known as El Rey Planeta, the planet king, because the sun never seemed to set on his dominion. To his family, he was a Habsburg first. Philip married Mariana of Austria, a girl nearly 30 years younger than himself, officially. It was a diplomatic union between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the dynasty. In truth, it was something far more disturbing. Mariana was his niece, her father. Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor, was Philip's own sister's husband. The connection was close enough to make even seasoned courtiers uneasy. But unease did not matter. Power did. Blood did. The church granted a dispensation. The court celebrated. Europe watched and said nothing. From this marriage came 5 children. 3 died before they could truly live. 2 survived. One was a boy, Carlos, later known to history as Charles II of Spain, even as a child. It was clear something was wrong. His jaw protruded grotesquely. His body was weak, his development painfully slow. As he aged, his condition worsened. By adulthood, he would struggle to speak clearly, to walk steadily, to think coherently. Many believed he was cursed. Others whispered of witchcraft. Few dared say the obvious truth. The other child was a girl. Her name was Margaret Theresa. At first glance, she seemed spared. She was small but lively, pale but delicate. Her features were soft, her expression alert. Compared to her brother, she appeared almost miraculous, a sign, perhaps, that the family's luck had not entirely run out. The court adored her. Her parents cherished her with an intensity born not only of love, but of fear. She was not just a daughter, she was proof. Proof that the Habsburg bloodline could still produce something beautiful, something viable, something worth preserving. No one asked whether preservation was the right goal. No one questioned whether a child should bear that weight. As Margaret grew, the court whispered of her future, not in dreams or hopes, but in calculations. Who she would marry, what crown she would secure, which branch of the family would claim her body next. She was still a toddler when her life stopped belonging to her. The Habsburgs had learned nothing from the dead children, nothing from the sick ones, nothing from the silence that followed each small coffin lowered into the ground. They would keep marrying their own. They would keep feeding the bloodline itself. And Margaret Theresa, bright, fragile, and unaware, was already being prepared to pay the price. Margaret Theresa grew up surrounded by silence disguised as luxury. The royal Alcazar of Madrid was a fortress of stone and ritual, its corridors heavy with incense, velvet, and obedience. Every sound echoed, heels on marble, whispered prayers, the rustle of silk skirts, but nothing ever truly felt alive. This was not a palace built for children. It was a machine designed to preserve authority from the moment she could walk. Margaret was watched. Maids adjusted her posture. Tutors corrected her speech. Priests monitored her devotion. Physicians examined her body with clinical concern, searching constantly for signs of weakness, any hint that the curse consuming her brother might also be hiding in her. Because Carlos was failing. As Margaret grew stronger, her brother grew stranger. Carlos II was years younger than Philip IV had been when he ascended the throne, yet already his future worried the entire court. He struggled to form words. His jaw jutted forward unnaturally, making speech difficult and eating painful. His muscles lacked strength. His moods shifted without warning. By the time he reached adolescence, it became clear to everyone except his parents that he would never rule effectively. The unspoken question hovered over Madrid like a storm cloud. What happens to an empire when its king cannot rule? The answer, quietly, became Margaret. She was groomed not as a ruler, but as a solution. Unlike Carlos, Margaret received constant attention. Her education was meticulous. She was taught Spanish court etiquette, French diplomacy, German conversation, and Latin prayers. She learned how to sit without slouching, how to lower her eyes without appearing weak, how to speak with warmth while revealing nothing. She was taught one lesson above all others. Her body was not her own. It was a vessel for alliances, a guarantee of succession, a bargaining chip wrapped in lace, despite the strictness of court life. Margaret remained affectionate and curious. She loved sweets, chocolate especially, and often hid them from physicians who feared excess could weaken her constitution. She laughed easily. She asked questions. She clung to her mother, Mariana, whose own life had been shaped by the same system now closing in around her daughter. Mariana saw too much of herself in Margaret to ignore the danger. She had been young once. She had been obedient. She had crossed borders and entered a marriage that had never truly belonged to her, and she had watched her children die. But Mariana had little power to intervene. Philip IV adored Margaret. Yet his love was inseparable from politics. To him, she was a treasure, something precious because it could be used. As his health declined and his anxiety over succession deepened, Margaret's value only increased. Portraits of the young Infanta were sent across Europe. Courts examined her face like merchants inspecting fine goods. Ambassadors wrote reports describing her beauty, her temperament, her apparent health. Her image traveled farther than she ever would as a child. One courtier wrote that Margaret appeared delicate but promising. Another noted that she possessed the softness required of a future empress. No one asked whether she wanted any of it. By the time Margaret was 5 years old, discussions about her marriage were no longer theoretical. They were active, serious, ruthless. The irony was cruel. The child meant to save the dynasty was being pushed toward the same practices that were destroying it. Her brother's condition worsened with each passing year. He became a symbol of anxiety, of decay. Physicians experimented, priests performed exorcisms. Nothing worked. The court began to accept what it feared most. Carlos might live, but the dynasty might not survive him. That made Margaret indispensable. She was dressed carefully, presented deliberately, protected obsessively. Every cough triggered concern. Every fever caused panic. Her health was monitored as though it belonged to the state. Because in truth, it did. She was not raised to choose. She was raised to continue. And as the weight of empire pressed quietly onto her small shoulders, no one noticed the most important truth of all. Margaret Theresa was not strong because the curse had spared her. She was strong because it had not reached her yet. By the time Margaret Theresa reached early childhood, the Spanish court no longer pretended that everything was fine. The empire still looked magnificent from the outside. Gold flowed in from the Americas. Ceremonies continued. Titles were exchanged. But behind closed doors, the anxiety was constant and suffocating. Spain's future rested on a fragile foundation, and everyone in the Alcázar knew it. King Philip IV was aging. His body weakened. His mood darkened. He prayed obsessively, and every prayer circled back to the same fear: succession. Carlos, his only surviving son, was alive, but barely functional. By the late 1650s, it was painfully obvious that the boy would never grow into the kind of ruler Spain required. He could not ride properly. He struggled to learn. He was often ill, often confused. Courtiers began to adjust their language around him, simplifying speech, masking concern with reverence. Hope quietly shifted elsewhere. It shifted to Margaret. She was still very young, but already her presence carried unnatural gravity. When she entered a room, conversations softened. When she fell ill, the palace held its breath. When she laughed, it sounded like reassurance. The court began to treat her not as a child, but as a symbol. She was the living counter-argument to Carlos's deterioration, proof that the Habsburg bloodline might still produce something whole, something usable. This belief made her precious and dangerous. Margaret's daily life followed an unforgiving routine. She rose early for prayers, attended lessons under strict supervision, and practiced court etiquette until it became instinct. Even play was regulated. Nothing that might cause injury, nothing that might exhaust her, nothing that might weaken what she represented. She learned quickly how to perform calm, how to smile when watched, how to lower her voice, how to hide fear behind obedience. The palace praised her composure, unaware that it was learned survival. Her relationship with her brother Carlos was complicated. He loved her in his own way, clinging to her presence when confusion overwhelmed him. Margaret, too young to fully understand his condition, sensed only that something about him frightened the adults. She noticed the way courtiers avoided his gaze, the way physicians lingered too long, the way prayers for him sounded different, less hopeful, more desperate, slowly. Margaret realized a truth no one explained to her outright. If Carlos failed, she would be required to compensate. Philip IV did nothing to dispel this reality. He adored Margaret deeply, but his affection was heavy with expectation. He commissioned more portraits, more formal appearances. He encouraged her education, especially languages tied to the Austrian branch of the family. German became increasingly important, not because Margaret needed it, but because Vienna did. As the Spanish court watched Carlos decline, discussions intensified, marriage negotiations multiplied. Each proposal was weighed not by affection, but by bloodlines and claims. The safest solution, as always, was the familiar one: keep the power within the family. Margaret did not yet know the names being spoken behind her back. She did not understand that her future husband had already been chosen, but she felt the shift. Childhood was slipping away faster than it should have. Her mother, Mariana, tried to shield her where she could. She stayed close. She allowed tenderness. But Mariana herself was a product of the same system. She had obeyed. She had endured. And she knew resistance came at a cost her daughter would pay anyway. By the late 1650s, Margaret Theresa was no longer simply a princess. She was a contingency plan, a solution to genetic failure, a body meant to correct a bloodline's mistake, a girl being quietly prepared to marry not for love, but for survival. No one called it cruelty. They called it duty. And somewhere within the walls of the Alcázar, surrounded by paintings, prayers, and whispered calculations, Margaret Theresa was growing up, unaware that the empire's future had already begun pressing down on her spine. The dynasty needed her, and soon, it would demand everything. Margaret Theresa did not remember the day she was born, but the palace never forgot it. The royal Alcázar of Madrid marked her existence the way it marked everything else, with ceremony, record, and expectation. Bells rang, courtiers bowed, prayers were spoken not just for her life, but for what her life might eventually repair. From the beginning, Margaret was treated less like a child and more like a miracle under observation. Physicians examined her constantly. Her breathing, her appetite, the strength of her limbs, everything was noted, compared, measured against the failures that had come before her. Each healthy day was quietly celebrated. Each minor illness caused fear that spread faster than any rumor, because the court already knew what too many Habsburg children had been: temporary. Margaret grew within a world where death was polite and ever-present. Small coffins had passed through the palace halls before she could speak. Names of siblings were whispered, not spoken aloud. Loss was absorbed into routine. Yet she survived. She learned to walk steadily. She learned to speak clearly. She laughed easily, often unaware that every sound she made reassured an empire teetering on uncertainty. Her parents watched her closely. Philip IV, weary and aging, saw in Margaret something close to relief. She was calm where Carlos was chaotic, alert where he was confused. When Margaret entered the room, she brought a quiet sense of order, something Philip's reign increasingly lacked. Mariana of Austria, however, watched her daughter with fear masked as devotion. She recognized the signs of scrutiny too well. She had once been that girl herself, young, obedient, married into obligation. She knew what came next. Margaret's days were structured early. She rose to prayer, dressed under supervision, and ate meals prepared with careful restraint. Physicians warned constantly against excess, too much sugar, too much excitement, too much movement. Health, they believed, could be preserved through discipline. Margaret disagreed silently. She adored sweets, especially chocolate, and hid them whenever she could. These small acts of rebellion went unnoticed by most, dismissed as harmless childish indulgence. But in truth, they were her earliest attempts at agency, tiny moments where she chose desire over expectation. Her education began almost as soon as she could sit still. Tutors taught her Spanish, French, and increasingly German. Latin prayers were drilled into her memory. Music and art were encouraged, not for joy, but refinement. Everything Margaret learned had a purpose beyond her understanding. She was being shaped, and as Margaret's world expanded, her brothers continued to shrink. Carlos II's condition worsened with time. His body failed to grow strong. His mind struggled to focus. He suffered frequent illnesses and unpredictable moods. Courtiers adjusted their behavior around him, treating him with exaggerated reverence that only emphasized his fragility. Margaret noticed the difference. She noticed how Carlos was pitied while she was praised, how he was protected while she was prepared, how his future seemed uncertain, while hers was already being drawn in invisible ink. Despite everything, Carlos loved her. He followed her when he could, growing calmer in her presence. Margaret, too young to understand the full scope of his condition, sensed only that he needed her in ways no one else did. But the court saw something else entirely. They saw risk. If Carlos ruled, Spain might collapse under indecision and instability. If he died without an heir, the dynasty could fracture. And so the focus shifted further toward Margaret, not as a queen, but as a guarantee. Her portraits began circulating beyond Spain. Painted likenesses were sent to Vienna, Paris, and other courts. Ambassadors commented on her appearance, her demeanor, her health. Each report was another evaluation, another step toward a future she did not yet comprehend. Margaret remained unaware of most of this. She was still a child. She played with dolls. She listened to stories. She clung to her mother's hand during long ceremonies. But even as innocence lingered, her childhood was already narrowing. Choices were disappearing before she knew they existed. The palace did not rush her. It didn't need to. Time, tradition, and blood would do the work. Margaret Theresa continued to grow, delicate, intelligent, watched by an empire that needed her far more than it loved her, and somewhere beyond the walls of Madrid. Decisions were forming that would soon drag her life away from everything she knew. As Margaret Theresa grew older, the palace tightened around her. The royal alcazar did not change, but her place within it did. What had once been indulgent attention became structured control. What had once been affection slowly hardened into supervision. Every hour of her day was now accounted for, not because she was difficult, but because she was valuable. Her body was still small, her voice still light, but the court no longer treated her as merely a child. She was becoming aware. Margaret learned early that nothing in her life happened by accident. Clothing was chosen carefully, never too bright, never too plain. Hairstyles were adjusted to emphasize elegance over youth. She was taught how to walk slowly, how to stand without fidgeting, how to listen without interrupting. Court etiquette was not simply manners. It was obedience perfected into habit. She attended Mass daily, kneeling for long stretches on stone floors without complaint. She memorized prayers she barely understood. Confessors praised her seriousness, noting her calm temperament and willingness to submit to the church. She appeared devout. To the court, reliable. Reliability mattered more than innocence. Her education intensified. Languages became more demanding. German, in particular, was emphasized, not casually, but persistently. Tutors corrected her accent with impatience. Letters from Vienna were read aloud in her presence, as though to familiarize her with a future not yet spoken aloud. Margaret sensed direction, even if she did not yet see the destination. Meanwhile, Carlos II continued to decline. By the time Margaret approached middle childhood, her brother's condition had become impossible to disguise. His speech remained slurred, his movements awkward. He tired easily, grew frustrated quickly, and struggled with basic lessons that Margaret absorbed effortlessly. Physicians were summoned more frequently. Remedies grew stranger. Prayers became darker. Some courtiers whispered that the king was cursed. Others claimed the bloodline itself was rotting. No one said these things openly, but fear does not require volume to spread. Philip IV watched both of his surviving children closely, measuring one against the other without ever admitting it. Carlos was his heir in name. Margaret was his heir in potential, and potential was dangerous. Margaret felt the shift in how people looked at her. The admiration grew heavier, more analytical. Compliments were no longer about her sweetness or charm, but about her composure, her intelligence, her promise. She did not know what she was promising. She was presented more often at court functions now, standing beside her parents while ambassadors observed. She learned to endure long ceremonies without complaint, to smile on command, to remain perfectly still while being discussed as though she were not present. Sometimes, she caught fragments of conversation, mentions of alliances, of Austria, of continuity. She did not yet hear the word marriage, but its shadow was already there. At night, Margaret retreated to her chambers exhausted, not from play, but from performance. Her mother often joined her, brushing her hair slowly, speaking softly in Spanish rather than the formal language of court. Mariana never spoke openly of fear. She had learned long ago that fear had no place in duty, but her touch lingered longer than necessary. Her prayers grew more frequent. She kissed Margaret's forehead as though committing the shape of her daughter to memory. Because Mariana knew what the palace demanded, she had lived it, and she could see it happening again. Margaret still found moments of joy. She loved music. She watched painters at work. She observed the servants more closely than the nobles, sensing truth in their unguarded movements. These moments grounded her, even as the walls of expectation closed in. But innocence does not stop fate. It only delays understanding. By the time Margaret reached the age where most children were still sheltered from consequence, her life had already been quietly redirected. Decisions were being finalized, agreements drafted, bloodlines calculated with cold precision. She was no longer just the king's daughter. She was the dynasty's insurance. And soon, the court would stop preparing her in silence and begin preparing her for departure. There was a moment, quiet, unrecorded, when Margaret Theresa stopped being treated as a person and began to be treated as an idea. No proclamation announced it. No ceremony marked the change. It happened gradually, through glances that lingered too long, through conversations that paused when she entered a room, through the way adults spoke about her future as though it were already settled. By the late 1650s, the Spanish court no longer asked if Margaret would be used to secure the dynasty. Only how. Her presence at court became increasingly deliberate. She was positioned carefully during audiences, guided to stand where ambassadors could observe her clearly. Her posture, her composure, even her silence were read as signs of stability. She appears healthy. She seems intelligent. She carries herself well. These were not compliments. They were evaluations. Philip IV understood this better than anyone. His reign was approaching its end, and the weight of failure pressed heavily on him. Spain was still vast, but its power was thinning. Wars drained resources. Rivals watched closely. And at the center of it all sat a king with a broken heir. Carlos II was alive. But the truth was undeniable. He could barely function without assistance. His body was fragile, his mind unfocused. Courtiers adjusted their expectations downward while pretending not to. Foreign powers took note. Spain looked strong, but it was vulnerable. That vulnerability sharpened the court's focus on Margaret. She was still young, but already spoken of in the language of continuity. Her health was monitored obsessively. Physicians recorded every detail. As though her body were a state document, any sign of illness triggered immediate intervention. The court could not afford another loss. Margaret noticed the tension. Even if she did not understand its cause, she sensed the anxiety behind smiles. The way her father's eyes lingered on her face. The way her brother was spoken to gently, cautiously, like something already broken. Carlos himself seemed aware of his own fragility. He clung to Margaret when confusion overwhelmed him. Sometimes he grew frustrated, sometimes frightened. Margaret comforted him instinctively, unaware that in doing so, she was reinforcing the court's silent conclusion. She was the functional one. She was the solution. The pressure did not come with cruelty. That was the most dangerous part. It came wrapped in praise, in protection, in reverence. Margaret was never threatened. She was never punished harshly. She was simply guided, always toward obedience, and she learned quickly. She learned how to disappear into stillness, how to answer without revealing opinion, how to listen without reacting. These were not skills taught to children. They were skills taught to assets. Her mother, Mariana, tried to preserve small pockets of normalcy, private moments, soft laughter, familiar stories from Austria. But even she could not stop what was unfolding. Mariana had been chosen once. Now her daughter was being chosen again. She knew what that meant. By the time Margaret approached adolescence, the whispers grew more direct. Names were spoken openly in council chambers. Proposals were drafted and discarded. The safest option, always, was internal. Austria, the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs, remained the most reliable ally Spain had. They shared blood, tradition, and ambition, and they shared the same fatal belief that power must remain within the family at all costs. Margaret did not yet know the identity of the man she would marry, but the decision had already been made. Her childhood narrowed into preparation. Lessons became more formal. Court appearances increased. Her German studies intensified. Even her appearance was adjusted subtly to present maturity sooner than nature intended. She felt herself being accelerated, pushed forward into a role she could sense but not yet name, at night. Margaret sometimes lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the palace. Footsteps, murmured prayers, the occasional cry of a child somewhere beyond her chambers. She did not know why these sounds unsettled her, only that they did. She was too young to understand that she was being positioned between two futures, one where the dynasty survived and one where it collapsed, and in both, her body was the instrument. The House of Habsburg had always believed it could outlast nature. that blood, properly controlled, could defy decay. Margaret Theresa was their latest experiment, and soon she would be asked to prove them right, no matter the cost. Margaret Theresa's childhood did not end suddenly. It narrowed as she grew older. The world around her did not expand the way childhoods are meant to. It became smaller, more controlled, more precise. The Royal Alcazar of Madrid remained magnificent, but to Margaret it increasingly felt like a beautifully decorated enclosure, a place where every step forward required permission. She was no longer shielded from court life. She was integrated into it. Each day followed a rigid pattern: morning prayers, lessons, supervised leisure, public appearances, evening devotions. Nothing was left unstructured, because structure created predictability, and predictability preserved order. Margaret adapted quickly. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent. She learned that curiosity was acceptable only when it did not challenge authority. She learned that obedience was not just expected, it was admired. The court praised her for being remarkably mature. They did not ask what that maturity cost. The Alcazar was filled with people. Yet Margaret often felt alone. Servants surrounded her constantly, but intimacy was rare. Even affection was formalized. Touch was gentle but brief. Praise was measured. Love, when expressed, carried expectation. She watched adults carefully, learning from their restraint. She noticed how they avoided speaking openly, how emotions were filtered before being displayed, how silence could communicate more than words. This was how power survived. Margaret's education reflected this philosophy. Her tutors were chosen not just for intelligence, but for loyalty. She studied history through the lens of dynasty. Battles won, marriages secured, alliances maintained. Failure was rarely discussed. And when it was framed as moral weakness rather than structural decay. Religion occupied a central place in her upbringing. She was taught that suffering was virtuous, that obedience was divine, that sacrifice was noble. These lessons were never framed as preparation, but they were. As Margaret's world became more ceremonial, her brother Carlos's became more restricted. He was increasingly kept away from public view, his appearances carefully timed and managed. When he did appear, courtiers responded with exaggerated deference, as though reverence could mask reality. Margaret noticed the difference in how they were treated. She was guided forward. Carlos was gently held back. She did not resent him. She felt something closer to unease, a sense that their paths were diverging in ways she did not fully understand. Carlos relied on her presence, seeking comfort in her familiarity. Margaret offered it instinctively, unaware that her calm reassured not only him, but the entire court. In contrast, her own comfort was rarely considered. As she grew, her body became a subject of increasing attention. Physicians monitored her development carefully, noting her appetite, her sleep, her complexion. Any irregularity prompted concern. The memory of dead children lingered in every examination. Margaret internalized this scrutiny without protest. She learned to remain still during inspections, to answer questions plainly, to ignore discomfort. Her body, she understood, was something that required approval outside the palace walls. Madrid lived loudly, markets bustling, streets alive with noise and color, but Margaret rarely saw it. When she did, it was through windows, balconies, or carefully orchestrated appearances. She belonged to the court, not the city, and the court belonged to tradition. By the time Margaret approached the age of 10, childhood had become something theoretical, something she remembered more than experienced. She had learned too much too early. She understood the weight of expectation without being told its destination. The unspoken truth was everywhere. She was not being raised to live freely. She was being raised to serve a purpose. The House of Habsburg had always believed control was strength. That order could defeat chaos. That blood, when guarded, could overcome decay. Margaret Theresa was being shaped to embody that belief. But behind the discipline, the prayers, and the polished calm, something fragile was forming. Something no tutor could correct and no physician could measure. A child growing up without choice. And the more perfectly she learned to perform her role, the less space remained for her to be anything else. As Margaret Theresa moved deeper into childhood, the Spanish court revealed its true nature, not as a home, but as a system that never rested. Nothing in the royal alcázar was accidental. Every corridor, every chamber, every ritual existed to reinforce hierarchy and control. Margaret had grown accustomed to being watched, but now she began to understand why. She was learning visibility. When she appeared at court, she was positioned deliberately, never too close, never too distant. Courtiers angled themselves to observe her face, her posture, her reactions. Ambassadors studied her like a living document, committing details to memory for reports destined for foreign capitals. Margaret learned to endure attention without responding to it. This skill, remaining present yet unreachable, became essential. Her tutors emphasized composure above all else. Emotional restraint was praised as maturity. Curiosity was acceptable only within strict boundaries. Questions about history or religion were encouraged. Questions about the future were gently redirected. There were answers she was not meant to hear yet. Religious discipline intensified alongside court training. Margaret attended Mass daily, sometimes more than once. She knelt on cold stone floors, repeating prayers until they lost individual meaning and became rhythm instead. Confessors spoke to her about humility, about the virtue of obedience, about the sanctity of sacrifice. No one explained why these lessons felt so urgent. The court, meanwhile, watched Carlos II with growing unease. As Margaret became more composed, Carlos became more erratic. His health fluctuated unpredictably. Some days he seemed almost lucid. On others, deeply confused. His jaw worsened. His body weakened. Physicians offered treatments that bordered on superstition. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Some believed he was bewitched. Others claimed divine punishment. Few were willing to confront the reality that haunted the palace. The bloodline itself was failing. Margaret noticed how Carlos was spoken to. Slowly, carefully, like someone already half absent. She noticed how expectations for him shrank while expectations for her grew. It was an unspoken transfer of responsibility. Her father, Philip IV, began involving her more frequently in formal appearances. She stood beside him during audiences, learning how to maintain stillness through long exchanges conducted in languages she did not always understand. Her presence was symbolic, a reassurance to those who feared instability. Philip rarely spoke to her directly about these matters. He did not need to. His approval came through proximity, through inclusion. His concern came through vigilance. He loved her, but his love was inseparable from fear. Margaret sensed it in his gaze, pride intertwined with urgency. She was not simply his daughter. She was a safeguard against collapse. At night, the palace did not quiet completely. There were always footsteps, always murmured prayers, always the rustle of servants moving unseen. Margaret learned to fall asleep amid constant motion, her mind slowly absorbing the truth that rest was a luxury not afforded to those who mattered. Her mother, Mariana, remained her emotional anchor in private moments. She softened the rigid structure imposed by court life. She spoke to Margaret in gentle tones, offering stories, reassurance, fragments of warmth that resisted the cold logic surrounding them. But even Mariana could not escape the system that shaped them both. She watched her daughter with a mixture of love and dread. She recognized the signs of preparation. She knew the language of duty too well to mistake it for care. And still, she said nothing, because resistance was impossible, because silence had always been survival. As Margaret grew, she became more aware of the distance between her inner world and the role she was expected to play. She felt emotions she was not encouraged to express: confusion, unease, fleeting resentment. She buried them quickly. Instinctively, she had learned that control was safety. The court rewarded her for it. By the time she reached the edge of adolescence, Margaret Theresa was no longer simply adapting to court life. She was excelling at it. She moved with ease through ceremonies. She spoke when required, listened when expected. She carried herself with a calm that reassured those around her. No one asked whether this calm was natural or learned. No one considered what it meant for a child to become so perfectly composed. Because the court did not value childhood, it valued continuity, and Margaret was becoming very good at preserving it, without ever being told the price she would soon be asked to pay. There is no single moment when childhood ends. For Margaret Theresa, it dissolved quietly, piece by piece, until one day she realized there was nothing left to lose. By the early 1660s, the Spanish court had stopped pretending that her future was undecided. The conversations that once paused when she entered a room now continued in softened tones. Names were spoken more openly. Vienna was no longer a distant reference. It was a destination taking shape. Margaret did not yet know when she would leave Spain, but she knew she would. Her days became increasingly formal. Court appearances multiplied. She was presented before foreign envoys with deliberate frequency, dressed not as a child, but as a young woman in waiting. Her movements were slower, more measured, her expressions carefully neutral. She was being transitioned, subtly, efficiently, out of childhood. The court justified this acceleration as necessity. Spain could not wait. The dynasty could not pause for sentiment. Carlos Sabegan's condition continued to deteriorate, and with each passing year, the reality grew more difficult to ignore. The king would be weak. The bloodline would be questioned. The empire would be vulnerable. Margaret's role solidified in response. She became the unspoken counterweight to her brother's fragility. Where Carlos inspired concern, she inspired reassurance. Where he symbolized decay, she symbolized possibility. And possibility had to be secured. Her education shifted accordingly. Lessons focused less on general refinement and more on preparation. She studied court protocol beyond Spain, Austrian customs, Viennese expectations, religious practices aligned with the Holy Roman Court. Her German became fluent, not conversational, but formal, the language of obligation. Margaret noticed how often Austria came up now, how frequently letters arrived from Vienna, how attentively her tutors corrected her when she made small cultural errors. She was being readied for a world not her own. At home, the emotional landscape grew heavier. Philip IV's health declined, and with it, his patience for uncertainty. He spent more time in prayer, more time consulting advisors. When he looked at Margaret, it was with a mixture of pride and urgency that frightened her. He never asked what she wanted. He did not need to. Margaret's mother, Mariana, watched helplessly as the final stages of preparation unfolded. She saw her daughter's gowns lengthen, her hairstyle change, her schedule harden into expectation. The tenderness of childhood was being replaced by the discipline of duty. Mariana tried, quietly, to delay the inevitable. She emphasized Margaret's youth, her fragility, her need for time. The court listened and moved forward anyway. because time was the one thing the dynasty believed it did not have. Margaret felt the shift most acutely in her relationship with her brother. Carlos sensed that something was changing. Even if he could not articulate it, he clung to her more desperately now, unsettled by her growing distance, physical and emotional. Margaret comforted him when she could, but her own presence at court was becoming increasingly regulated. She was needed elsewhere, watched elsewhere, prepared elsewhere. They were being separated by expectation, at night. Margaret lay awake longer than before. Sleep came reluctantly, interrupted by thoughts she could not fully form. She felt fear without a clear object, loss without a defined absence. She sensed she was approaching a threshold she would not be allowed to cross back over. No one had spoken the word marriage to her directly yet, but its outline was everywhere, in the lessons, the letters, the way her future was discussed without her involvement. She was no longer a daughter being raised. She was a solution being finalized. The House of Habsburg had always demanded sacrifice from its members, but it rarely acknowledged the human cost. Individuals existed to serve the dynasty, not the other way around. Margaret Theresa had been shaped patiently for this purpose. Her obedience, her composure, her silence, none of it was accidental. It was the result of years of careful conditioning. And now, as childhood faded completely, she stood on the edge of a life she had never chosen. She did not know the man she would marry. She did not know the city she would live in. She did not know how much her body would be asked to endure. But the court knew, and that was enough. The decision was made. The path was set. The girl was ready. What remained was only the journey and the price. In 1656, when Margaret Theresa was just 5 years old, she was immortalized, whether she understood it or not. The painting was commissioned quietly, without ceremony, as many important decisions at the Spanish court were. Diego Velázquez, the most celebrated painter of his age and the king's trusted court artist, was summoned to do what he had done many times before: capture power on canvas. But this time, the subject was not a king, it was a child. Margaret was led into the painter's studio inside the royal Alcázar, a space that felt different from the rest of the palace. The air smelled of oil and pigment instead of incense. Light entered deliberately, guided by tall windows. The usual stiffness of court life softened, just slightly. Velázquez positioned her at the center. She stood small and pale in a wide dress that seemed almost too heavy for her body. Her hair was styled carefully, her posture corrected gently. Around her clustered members of her household, ladies in waiting adjusting her gown, attendants frozen mid-motion. At first glance, it looked like a simple scene of court life. It wasn't. The painting, later known as Las Meninas, was something unprecedented. It did not merely depict Margaret, it framed her. She was not presented as playful or innocent, but composed, observant, already aware of being seen. Her gaze met the viewer directly. For a child, it was unsettling. Velázquez painted her as the axis around which the entire room turned. The servants leaned toward her. The light fell on her face. Even the painter himself placed his own image within the canvas. Watching her, and us, in the background, reflected faintly in a mirror, stood Philip IV and Mariana. They were present, but distant. Authority without immediacy. Parents rendered as symbols. Margaret did not understand the implications of what was happening. She only knew she was being asked to stand still for a very long time, that adults were studying her expression carefully, that her stillness mattered. What the court saw, however, was far more significant. They saw a child who could be centered, a child who could command attention without movement, a child who could embody stability. Las Meninas was not just a portrait, it was a statement. It told Europe that Spain still had something intact, something refined, something worth preserving. Margaret became, in that moment, a public image. The painting circulated through reputation long before it traveled physically. Word spread of the Infanta's poise, her beauty, her calm. She was discussed not as a daughter, but as a symbol of continuity, proof that the Habsburg bloodline had not yet failed completely. And Velázquez would paint her again and again over the following years. 5 known portraits of Margaret were produced, each documenting her growth, each reinforcing her role. As her dresses grew more elaborate and her posture more formal, the transformation was unmistakable. The paintings did not capture a carefree childhood. They captured preparation. Margaret's likeness became one of the most reproduced images of any royal child in early modern Europe. Her face traveled farther than she ever had. Courts studied her features, searching for signs of health, intelligence, fertility. She was being evaluated visually long before she was evaluated in person. And still, she remained unaware. To Margaret, the sittings were tiring but unremarkable. She liked Velázquez. He spoke to her gently, without the urgency others carried. In his presence, she sensed something close to normalcy, someone who observed without calculating, but even Velázquez was part of the system. The painting he created would outlive her. It would define how history remembered her. Las Meninas froze Margaret at a moment before understanding, before obligation fully settled in. A child standing at the center of power, surrounded by adults, watched by rulers, observed by history. She did not yet know that this image, this quiet, composed little girl, would become one of the most famous faces in European art. Nor did she know the cruel irony behind it. The world would remember her still. But her life would be anything but. After Las Meninas, Margaret Theresa was never unseen again. The painting did more than immortalize her. It changed how she was perceived. No longer just the king's daughter. She became an image circulated through whispers, letters, and reputation. Courtiers spoke of her composure. Ambassadors commented on her presence. Artists and nobles alike referenced the calm intensity of her gaze. She had become recognizable without being known. Within the royal Alcázar, the effect was immediate. Margaret's appearances were now treated as events. When she entered a room, people noticed, not out of affection, but assessment, her posture, her expression. The way she carried herself were silently compared to the girl frozen on canvas. She was expected to live up to her portrait. That expectation reshaped her behavior. Margaret grew increasingly conscious of being observed, even when no one appeared to be watching. She learned to regulate her movements, to suppress spontaneous reactions, to maintain a controlled neutrality that mirrored the image Velázquez had captured. The irony was cruel. The more still she became in life, the more vivid her painted likeness seemed. Velázquez continued to paint her over the years, documenting not joy, but progression. Each portrait showed a child growing older, heavier gowns replacing playful dresses, formality overtaking softness. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. Margaret watched these paintings accumulate without understanding their purpose. She saw herself reflected back as something finished, something complete, while she still felt uncertain. Incomplete, to the court. However, the message was clear. She was aging well. She was composed. She was suitable. In an era where royal marriages were negotiated through appearances as much as bloodlines, these images carried immense weight. They traveled to Vienna, to Paris, to other courts where Margaret herself could not go. They spoke for her, defining her before she ever spoke a word in her own defense. Her mother, Mariana, understood the danger of this visibility. She had once been evaluated in much the same way. Her worth measured by youth, obedience, and the promise of fertility. She tried, gently, to shield Margaret from the full implications of her growing fame. But shielding was impossible. The court had already decided that Margaret's visibility was an asset too valuable to limit. Public appearances increased. She was positioned carefully during ceremonies. Her presence used to reassure observers that the Spanish line still held potential. Margaret learned to endure these moments quietly, her face calm even as the weight of expectation pressed harder each year. She rarely complained. She had been taught not to. And yet, in private, she began to feel something new, distance from herself. The girl in the paintings looked serene, confident, complete. The girl inside felt uncertain, watched, and increasingly detached from her own reflection. Margaret sensed that the image mattered more than the reality. That realization unsettled her. She found brief comfort in moments of solitude, listening to music, watching servants work, observing light move across palace walls. These small, unguarded experiences reminded her that life still existed beyond performance. But such moments grew rarer. As Margaret approached adolescence, her body changed, and with it, the scrutiny intensified. Physicians monitored her development closely. Any deviation from expectation caused concern. The court's memory was long, and the failures of the past haunted every examination. Health was no longer personal. It was political. The portraits continued. Each one documented not who Margaret was, but what she was becoming. A vessel for continuity. A promise framed in silk and oil paint. Las Meninas had captured her at the threshold, old enough to be observed, young enough to be controlled. The paintings that followed carried her forward toward a future that grew clearer to everyone but her. And as her image traveled farther, the space for her own voice shrank. Margaret Theresa was being remembered before she was truly allowed to live. And the world, already familiar with her face, felt entitled to decide what came next. By the time Margaret Theresa reached the edge of adolescence, the difference between who she was and who she represented had become impossible to ignore. The court no longer spoke of her growth in terms of childhood. Words like sweet and playful disappeared, replaced by composed, elegant, promising. Each compliment carried an unspoken condition. She was valuable because she could be used. Margaret sensed this even if she could not yet articulate it. She moved through the palace with practiced ease, her gestures refined by years of observation. Servants adjusted her gowns with reverence. Courtiers bowed with a seriousness once reserved for her parents. The transformation was complete. She was still young, but no longer treated as such. The paintings that surrounded her had become silent reminders of expectation. She saw herself not as she felt, but as others wanted her to be. Each canvas showed a version of Margaret frozen in control, framed by luxury, untouched by doubt. She wondered sometimes which one was real. Her mother, Mariana, noticed the change. She watched her daughter retreat inward, becoming quieter, more reserved. Where Margaret had once laughed easily, she now smiled politely. Where curiosity had once surfaced freely, it was now measured and cautious. Mariana recognized the signs all too well. She had once been that girl, in private moments. Mariana tried to draw Margaret out, asking about her thoughts, her fears, her desires. Margaret answered honestly at first, then increasingly carefully. She had learned that even honesty could be dangerous if overheard. Silence, she realized, was safer. The court rewarded her restraint. Advisors praised her maturity. Ambassadors described her as remarkably self-possessed. The very traits that protected her from scrutiny also erased her presence. She was becoming invisible behind perfection. As Margaret's visibility increased abroad, the discussions surrounding her future intensified at home. Marriage negotiations, once abstract, grew concrete. Letters arrived more frequently. Councils met behind closed doors. Names were spoken openly now. Austria was no longer implied. It was confirmed. Margaret overheard fragments of conversation, references to Vienna, to alliance, to duty. She did not yet know the man she would marry, but she understood that her future would take her far from Madrid. The realization landed heavily. Spain was all she had ever known. The Alcázar, for all its control, was familiar. Its rhythms, its sounds, its faces were woven into her sense of self. The thought of leaving unsettled her deeply, but uncertainty was not something she was allowed to express. Her father, Philip IV, grew more distant as his health declined. When he did speak to Margaret, it was with gentle authority, emphasizing her importance, her responsibility. He did not ask if she was afraid. Fear, after all, served no purpose. Margaret felt herself being carried forward by momentum she could not resist. Each day brought her closer to a life she had not chosen, shaped by decisions made long before she understood their meaning. The girl inside the portrait, the one captured by Velázquez, had become an ideal others projected onto her. That image followed her everywhere, shaping expectations, silencing questions, narrowing possibilities. She wondered, sometimes, if that girl had ever existed at all, or if she had always been something else entirely, a symbol mistaken for a person, a promise mistaken for a life. As adolescence approached, Margaret Theresa stood on the brink of departure, emotionally, if not yet physically. The palace that had raised her was already loosening its hold, preparing to pass her on like a precious object. She did not know how quickly everything would change. She did not know how little time she had left to be herself. All she knew was that the world had decided who she would become, and the girl inside the portrait was about to step into a future painted by others. Long before Margaret Theresa understood what marriage meant, her name was already moving across Europe, not spoken with affection, not whispered with hope, but calculated, quietly, relentlessly, by men who would never meet her in the courts of 17th century Europe. Marriage was not a union between two people. It was a weapon, a treaty, a way to redraw borders without firing a single shot. And, as the daughter of the King of Spain, Margaret was one of the most valuable pieces on the board. By the time she reached her early teens, discussions about her future were no longer speculative. They were urgent. Spain was weakening. Years of war had drained its treasury. Rival powers, France above all, watched closely for signs of instability. And at the center of the empire sat Carlos II, a king in waiting who could barely rule himself, let alone a global dominion. Every foreign court understood the danger. If Carlos died without an heir, Spain would become a prize. If he lived but failed to rule, Spain would fracture from within. That made Margaret Theresa indispensable. She was not being prepared to rule Spain, but to secure it. Marriage proposals arrived from across Europe, each wrapped in politeness and ambition. Every suitor represented not a man, but a political future. Alliances were weighed, risks assessed, bloodlines traced with obsessive care. For a brief moment, the Spanish court considered a daring alternative. England. There were discussions, quiet but serious, about a potential marriage between Margaret and Charles Stuart, who would later become Charles II of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Such a union could have reshaped the balance of power in Western Europe, forging an unexpected alliance against France. To outsiders, It may have seemed almost romantic. It was not. Religion posed a problem. England was Protestant, Spain was fiercely Catholic. Trust between the two crowns was fragile, shaped by decades of rivalry and suspicion. And above all, Philip IV refused. Not because the match was unworkable, but because it was foreign. Philip had spent his life defending the Habsburg legacy. To him, the idea of his daughter marrying outside the family was not strategic. It was dangerous. Power, once shared, could not be reclaimed. The safest solution had always been the same: keep the blood inside the house. As negotiations with England collapsed, the focus returned where it always did: Austria. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs was not just familiar, it was trusted. They shared the same lineage, the same traditions, the same fatal confidence that blood alone guaranteed stability, and they already had a candidate. Leopold I. Margaret did not yet know his name, but he was already being discussed in council chambers. He was young, deeply religious, musically inclined, and most importantly, Habsburg through and through. He was also something else. He was her uncle. Leopold was the younger brother of her mother, Mariana. He was also her first cousin through her father's side. The connection was so close it unsettled even seasoned diplomats, but discomfort had never stopped the dynasty before. The church would approve it, the court would justify it, Europe would accept it, and Margaret would comply. No one asked her opinion. They did not need to. Royal daughters were not raised to choose. They were raised to submit gracefully. Margaret sensed the shift before she understood it. Conversations around her grew more guarded. Her tutors emphasized Austrian customs with new intensity. Her mother's concern deepened. Though she spoke little, the chessboard was being cleared. Soon, Margaret would be moved. She was still a girl, quiet, observant, unsure of what was being decided on her behalf. She did not yet understand that the future being arranged for her would demand not just her presence, but her body, her health, and ultimately her life. The men making these decisions spoke of stability, of duty, of legacy. They did not speak of consequence. And so, as Europe positioned its pieces, Margaret Theresa stood at the center of the board, valuable, silent, and completely expendable. Margaret Theresa learned about her future the way most royal women did, not through conversation, but through atmosphere. The palace changed before a single word was spoken to her. Letters arrived more frequently. Councils met behind closed doors for longer hours. Her tutors adjusted her lessons without explanation, placing sudden emphasis on Austrian etiquette, on Viennese court customs, on the subtle differences in protocol that separated Spain from the Holy Roman Empire. No one told her why. They did not need to. Margaret had grown skilled at reading silence. She understood that when adults avoided her eyes, it meant decisions had already been made, and now they avoided her constantly. The name Leopold began to surface, first indirectly, then openly. She heard it spoken by courtiers who assumed she was too young to understand. She heard it in prayers whispered by her mother late at night. She heard it in the careful language of advisors speaking to her father. Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, her uncle. The realization did not come with shock. It came with a dull, creeping heaviness, an understanding that settled slowly into her chest. This was not unexpected. She had been raised within the Habsburg world long enough to know that closeness of blood had never been an obstacle. Still, knowing did not make it easier. Margaret was 11 years old when the court officially announced her betrothal. The proclamation was delivered with solemnity, framed as honor and destiny. She was praised for her importance, her maturity, her role in securing peace between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the dynasty. Words like duty and sacrifice were spoken as though they were virtues she already possessed. No one asked if she was afraid. The betrothal did not mean immediate marriage. There were limits even in the 17th century, but it did mean that her life was no longer theoretical. It had a destination, a husband, a future measured not in years, but in preparation. Leopold was not a stranger to her. Exactly. She knew of him through family portraits, through letters read aloud at court, through stories of his devotion and intellect. He was described as kind, thoughtful, deeply religious, qualities meant to reassure. What no one mentioned was the imbalance. He was a grown man. She was a child. Margaret absorbed the news quietly. She did not cry. She did not protest. Years of conditioning had taught her that obedience was safer than resistance, that composure earned approval, that acceptance was expected. Her mother, Mariana, struggled more visibly. She had lived this fate once. She knew the isolation of leaving one's homeland, the strain of a marriage shaped by duty rather than choice. She understood the physical cost of repeated pregnancies, the emotional toll of existing solely to produce heirs. She tried, gently, to delay the inevitable. Margaret was young. She argued, fragile, in need of time. The court listened and ignored her, because time was not something the dynasty believed it could afford. Carlos II's condition continued to worsen. His inability to rule was no longer a secret. Foreign powers took note. France watched carefully. Every delay increased the risk of instability. Margaret's marriage was not about her happiness. It was about containment. The betrothal changed everything. Her daily routine became stricter, her movements more controlled, her appearances more formal. She was no longer treated as a girl in preparation, but as a future empress in waiting. Even her language shifted. She was encouraged to address Leopold in letters, not as a future husband, but as uncle. The closeness was not hidden. It was normalized. The court did not flinch from it. Margaret did. Not openly, but internally. She struggled to reconcile the roles being forced upon her. Niece, wife, empress. The contradictions tangled in her mind, creating a quiet confusion she could not voice. At night, she lay awake longer than before, her thoughts circling questions without answers. What would Vienna be like? Would she ever return to Spain? Would she be alone? She did not yet understand the full cost of what had been decided. She could not know how completely this marriage would consume her body, her health, her youth. All she knew was that her life had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back. The betrothal had been announced, the alliance secured, the child promised, and Margaret Theresa, obedient and silent, stepped fully into the role the dynasty had prepared for her since birth, unaware that this decision would mark the beginning of the end. Everything accelerated. Her childhood, already fragile, disappeared completely beneath layers of preparation. What had once been subtle guidance became direct instruction. What had once been expectation became obligation. The Spanish court shifted its attention from whether she was suitable to how quickly she could be delivered. Margaret was 11 years old. From that moment on, her life was treated as a countdown. Her tutors intensified their efforts. German replaced Spanish as the primary language of instruction. Austrian court protocol was drilled relentlessly. How to greet nobles, how to address the emperor, how to move through ceremonies in Vienna without appearing provincial or weak. She learned the customs of a court she had never seen. For a marriage she could barely comprehend. Her body, too, became a focus of increasing concern. Physicians examined her more frequently, noting her growth with unsettling precision. Her health was no longer simply monitored, it was managed. Diets were adjusted, activities restricted. Everything was designed to preserve her for what came next. No one framed it as preparation for intimacy or motherhood, but that was exactly what it was. Margaret felt the change in how people spoke to her. The tone softened, but the distance grew. She was no longer treated as a child to be guided, but as a future empress to be preserved. Even affection became formal, cautious, filtered through duty. Her mother, Mariana, watched this transformation with quiet desperation. She tried to maintain closeness, shared prayers, whispered conversations late at night, but even these moments were increasingly rare. The court required Margaret's presence elsewhere. She belonged less to her mother now, and more to the dynasty. Mariana understood the danger more clearly than anyone else. She knew the physical toll this marriage would demand. She had lived through repeated pregnancies, illness, exhaustion. She knew how little control a woman held over her own body once duty took over, and she saw, with terrifying clarity, that her daughter was far more fragile than the court wanted to admit. But fear was not persuasive in a system built on blood. Philip IV did not waver. His health was declining, his anxiety deepening. He needed reassurance that the Habsburg line would continue, that Spain would not fall into chaos after his death. Margaret was that reassurance. He spoke to her gently, emphasizing honor and responsibility. He told her she was special, important, chosen. He did not mention the cost, because, to him, sacrifice was inherent to royalty. Margaret listened quietly. She had learned long ago that obedience was safer than resistance, that silence was survival, that asking questions led nowhere. So she accepted her role. Outwardly, she appeared calm, composed, dutiful. The court praised her maturity, mistaking submission for strength. Inwardly, something shifted. Margaret began to withdraw emotionally, guarding her thoughts carefully. She no longer spoke freely, even in private. She observed more than she participated. She learned to endure rather than engage. This emotional distance was not rebellion. It was self-preservation. As the months passed, preparations for her departure intensified. Correspondence with Vienna became constant. Gifts were exchanged. Portraits were sent ahead, visual proof of the bride Leopold would soon claim. Margaret saw herself depicted again and again. Poised, elegant, flawless. None of the portraits showed fear. None showed uncertainty. None showed a child being surrendered to a system that did not care whether she survived, only whether she produced heirs. The court spoke of the marriage as a solution, as a stabilizing force, as a triumph of tradition. No one spoke of what it meant to bind a girl's future to a bloodline already collapsing under its own weight. Margaret did not yet know how soon she would leave Spain. She did not know how long the journey would take, or how final it would be. She did not know that Vienna would drain her strength, that pregnancy would begin almost immediately, that her body would never recover. She only knew that everything familiar was slipping away. The Alcázar no longer felt like home. It felt like a holding place. A final pause before transfer. The House of Habsburg had secured its move. The peace was committed. And Margaret Theresa, child, niece, future wife, stood at the edge of a life she had never been allowed to choose, carrying the full weight of a dynasty that believed blood was worth any price, including hers. By the time the final decision was made, Madrid already felt like a memory. In early 1666, the Spanish court announced what everyone had long expected. Margaret Theresa would leave Spain to marry Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. She was not yet 15. The language surrounding the announcement was careful, measured, ceremonial, reverent. It spoke of unity, of destiny, of sacred duty. It did not speak of fear. It did not speak of age, and it certainly did not speak of the irreversible nature of what was about to happen. Margaret listened in silence as the words were read. She had been prepared for this moment her entire life, yet nothing could soften its finality. The palace she had known since birth, the Alcázar with its echoing corridors and suffocating rituals, was no longer a place of permanence. It was a point of departure. Spain was letting her go. The months that followed were consumed by preparation. Her household was reorganized. Loyal servants were selected to accompany her to Vienna, chosen not for comfort, but for control. Every item she would carry was catalogued, approved, symbolic. Gowns were tailored for ceremony rather than movement. Jewelry was selected to represent dynastic continuity rather than personal taste. Margaret's possessions told a story she did not yet understand. She was not traveling to begin a life. She was being transferred to fulfill one. Her mother, Mariana, remained close during these final months. Though her composure grew increasingly strained, she had walked this path once herself, leaving Austria for Spain as a young girl, uncertain and obedient. Now she was watching her daughter repeat the same journey in reverse. History was folding in on itself. Mariana offered guidance where she could. Quiet advice, practical reassurance, small moments of tenderness that resisted the weight of protocol. But even she could not disguise the truth. Once Margaret left Madrid, she would never truly return. Her father, Philip IV, was already ailing. He spent less time at court, more time in prayer. When he did see Margaret, his affection was heavy, almost urgent. He spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of the importance of her role. He never said goodbye. Kings did not say goodbye to assets. The departure itself was carefully staged. Margaret did not travel alone. She led a grand procession meant to display Spanish power and prestige across Europe. The journey would take 6 months, winding slowly through cities and courts where she would be presented. Admired, evaluated, it was both escort and exhibition. As the convoy left Madrid, Margaret watched the city recede behind her. She did not cry. Years of discipline had taught her that public emotion served no purpose. But inside, something fractured quietly. She was leaving behind her brother. Carlos II watched her go with visible distress. Confused by the sudden separation, Margaret embraced him tightly, lingering longer than protocol allowed. For a moment, the court's rigid structure faltered under the weight of something human. Then it corrected itself. The journey was exhausting. Ceremonial stops required Margaret to appear constantly, standing, greeting, smiling, enduring long receptions in unfamiliar cities. She was praised everywhere she went. Compliments followed her like a script. So young, so composed, so perfectly suited. No one asked how she felt. By the time she crossed into Austrian territory, Margaret was already drained. The pace had been relentless, the expectations unyielding. She was no longer a child being prepared for marriage. She was a bride in transit. Vienna awaited her with grandeur and anticipation. The court there had prepared meticulously. The Holy Roman Empire would welcome its new empress with celebration, ceremony, and spectacle. Margaret had not yet met Leopold in person. She knew him only through letters, portraits, and whispered descriptions. He was described as gentle, devout, intelligent. She was told he would care for her. No one mentioned that he was her uncle. No one mentioned that her body would soon be put to work. No one mentioned that her health would not survive what was expected of her. as the journey neared its end. Margaret's thoughts grew quieter, heavier. The girl who had once wandered the halls of the Alcazar had been replaced by someone older, more restrained, more distant. Childhood was no longer behind her. It had been left behind, deliberately, somewhere along the road between Madrid and Vienna. And waiting at the end of that road was a marriage that would redefine her life, not as her own, but as a continuation of a bloodline already on the verge of collapse. Vienna greeted Margaret Theresa with celebration, but not warmth. When the Spanish procession finally arrived in December 1666, the city was alive with ceremony. Bells rang, crowds gathered, banners bearing the double-headed eagle of the Holy Roman Empire lined the streets. To the people of Vienna, this was a triumph. The Habsburg bloodline was being sealed once again. To Margaret, it felt unreal. She had spent 6 months traveling toward this moment. Yet nothing could prepare her for the disorientation of arrival. The language sounded harsher. The customs felt unfamiliar. Even the air seemed heavier, colder than Madrid. She was no longer surrounded by what she knew, only by what was expected of her. The court of Vienna was different from Spain's, but no less rigid. Where Madrid was solemn and inward-looking, Vienna was theatrical and intensely hierarchical. Every gesture carried meaning. Every movement was scrutinized, and at the center of it all stood Leopold Fürst. Margaret met her husband for the first time not as a man, but as a ruler. Leopold was young for an emperor, yet already burdened by responsibility. He was deeply religious, reserved, more comfortable with music and scholarship than with intimacy. When he greeted Margaret, his manner was gentle, almost awkward. He addressed her not with romance, but familiarity. She called him uncle, and he did not object. The closeness of their blood was not hidden or softened. It was accepted as fact, another necessary compromise in the Habsburg pursuit of continuity. What might have shocked others was normalized within the family. The marriage ceremony took place on December 12, 1666. It was magnificent. Nobles from across Europe attended. The cathedral glittered with gold and candlelight. Music filled the air. The empire presented itself as eternal, unbroken, divinely ordained. Margaret stood at the altar small and pale, her gown heavy with embroidery and expectation. She moved carefully, as though aware that one wrong step might shatter the illusion surrounding her. She was 14. The vows were spoken in ritual language older than either of them. Promises of obedience, of union, of duty to God and dynasty. Margaret repeated the words flawlessly, her voice steady despite the weight of their meaning. The court applauded. The celebrations did not end with the ceremony. They continued for months: feasts, performances, religious observances, public appearances. Margaret was everywhere, always composed, always watched. She was now Holy Roman Empress, behind the spectacle. The marriage itself was strangely distant. Leopold treated Margaret with politeness and respect, but intimacy did not come naturally. Their relationship was shaped more by ritual than affection. They shared interests in music and art, and Leopold made efforts to ensure her comfort, but the imbalance between them was unmistakable. He was a grown man, accustomed to authority. She was a child, conditioned to obey it. Margaret struggled with homesickness almost immediately. She clung to her Spanish identity, refusing to fully abandon her language or customs. She resisted learning German beyond what was necessary, surrounding herself instead with familiar servants and habits from Madrid. Vienna felt foreign in every sense. Her body, already strained by travel and ceremony, began to show signs of weakness. She grew pale, Fatigue followed her constantly. Physicians dismissed it as adjustment, temporary discomfort that would pass. It did not. Within months, Margaret was pregnant. The announcement was met with celebration. Bells rang again. Prayers of gratitude filled the court. The marriage was already fulfilling its purpose. No one asked how Margaret felt. Pregnancy took an immediate toll on her fragile health. Nausea confined her to her chambers. Weakness left her breathless. Yet she continued to appear when required, smiling faintly as the court praised her fertility. She was doing exactly what she had been sent to do. Leopold, for his part, seemed relieved. An heir meant security. It justified everything. The marriage, the scrutiny, the sacrifice. He did not question whether her body could endure what was being demanded of it. By the time Margaret realized how completely her life had changed, there was no space left to resist. Her childhood was not just over. It had been consumed. She was now an empress, a wife, a vessel for succession, living proof that the Habsburg bloodline could still reproduce. What no one yet acknowledged was how much it was costing her. The union had been sealed, the dynasty reassured, the machine of inheritance set in motion once more. And Margaret Theresa, far from home and already breaking under the strain, was only at the beginning of what her marriage would take from her. Marriage did not settle Margaret Theresa into her new life. It accelerated her decline in Vienna. There was no pause after the wedding, no space for recovery, no allowance for youth. The celebrations faded, but the expectations did not. Margaret was now Holy Roman Empress, and that title came with a single overriding obligation: produce heirs. Her first pregnancy dominated everything. Physicians hovered constantly, offering advice rooted more in tradition than understanding. Diets were imposed, movements restricted, remedies administered without question. Margaret obeyed, though her body resisted at every step. She was often confined to her chambers, too weak to stand for long. Dizziness followed her relentlessly, yet when appearances were required, she dressed carefully, masking exhaustion behind etiquette. The court praised her endurance. They mistook suffering for strength. Leopold remained attentive but distant. He took his role seriously, ensuring Margaret was treated with respect, but he did not challenge the system demanding so much of her. To him, the strain was unfortunate, but necessary. Emperors thought in generations, not in years. Margaret thought in days. She missed Spain desperately. The language, the light, the familiarity of the Alcázar in Vienna. Even her identity felt diluted. Her Spanish customs were tolerated, not embraced. Her accent marked her as foreign in a court that now claimed her completely. Isolation settled in quietly. She relied heavily on the few Spanish attendants who had traveled with her, familiar voices in a sea of German and Latin. They became her emotional lifeline, witnessing her gradual physical decline with growing alarm. The pregnancy ended in tragedy. In September 1667, Margaret gave birth to a son, Ferdinand. For a brief moment, the court celebrated wildly. Bells rang. Te Deums were sung. The dynasty had its proof, but the joy was short-lived. The child was weak, fragile, too familiar a pattern for those who knew the family history. In January 1668, after only a few months of life, Ferdinand died. Margaret's grief was private and absolute. She had barely recovered from childbirth when the loss struck. The physical toll was devastating, but the emotional blow cut deeper. She had been told, implicitly, relentlessly, that her worth lay in producing heirs, and now the heir was gone. The court mourned politely and moved on. Margaret was expected to recover quickly. Another pregnancy was necessary. Another chance had to be taken. The dynasty could not wait for her body to heal or her grief to settle. She was pregnant again within a year. This time, the child survived. In January 1669, Margaret gave birth to a daughter, Maria Antonia. The court rejoiced once more, though with measured enthusiasm. A daughter was welcome, but a son was still needed. Maria Antonia became Margaret's single source of genuine comfort. Despite exhaustion, despite illness, she clung to her child with a desperation that alarmed those around her. For the first time since leaving Spain, Margaret had something that felt hers, but her body did not recover. Each pregnancy left her weaker than before. Her complexion grew paler, her features more drawn. The distinctive Habsburg jaw became increasingly pronounced, a physical marker of the bloodline she embodied. Physicians began to whisper concerns. Margaret was often bedridden, even when not pregnant. She complained of fatigue, pain, and difficulty breathing. But the court dismissed these symptoms as the natural burden of empresshood. In February 1670, she gave birth to another son, John Leopold. He died within hours. Margaret did not have the strength to weep. Another pregnancy followed. Another child, Maria Anna, born in 1672, lived only 2 weeks. Each loss compounded the damage. Each birth took something permanent from Margaret's already fragile health. In 6 years, she endured 6 pregnancies, 4 live births, and 2 miscarriages. Her body was never allowed to rest. Her spirit grew quieter with each passing year. The lively girl who had once been painted at the center of Las Meninas was gone. In her place stood a young woman hollowed out by expectation, surviving from obligation to obligation. Vienna whispered about her condition. Ambassadors noted her frequent illnesses. Observers remarked on her sadness, her isolation, her fading presence. Yet nothing changed. The dynasty still needed heirs. The marriage still served its purpose. Margaret was still expected to endure. By the early 1670s, it was clear to anyone willing to see that she was breaking. Her health deteriorated rapidly. Physicians diagnosed an enlarged thyroid, a condition they could neither treat nor fully understand. There was no cure. There was only continuation. Margaret Theresa had been married to secure a bloodline already collapsing under its own weight. And now, that same bloodline was draining the life from her. Pregnancy by pregnancy, loss by loss. She was only 20. Her childhood had been taken. Her youth had been consumed. Her body had become a battlefield for inheritance. And still, the court waited for one more son, one more chance, one more sacrifice. Margaret had nothing left to give, but the dynasty had not yet finished with her. By the early 1670s, Vienna no longer felt like a court. It felt like a waiting room. Margaret Theresa spent more time in bed than on her feet. The once celebrated young empress, whose arrival had been marked by months of music and ceremony, now existed mostly behind closed doors. When she did appear, it was brief, carefully staged moments meant to reassure the court that she was still alive, still functioning, still useful. Her body was failing, and everyone knew it. Vienna's physicians recorded her condition with growing unease. She suffered from chronic fatigue, shortness of breath, swelling in her neck, and recurring fevers. Even when she was not pregnant, she was weak. Even when she rested, she did not recover. They diagnosed her with an enlarged thyroid, a condition poorly understood at the time and entirely untreatable. Remedies were attempted, ointments, tonics, prayer, but nothing reversed the damage. Margaret's decline was slow, relentless, and impossible to hide. The court responded not with alarm, but with adjustment. Her schedule was reduced. Appearances were shortened. Expectations were reframed. Instead of demanding constant visibility, the court learned to work around her absence. She was no longer expected to shine, only to survive long enough to produce another heir. Leopold I watched this deterioration with conflicted detachment. He did not mistreat Margaret. By all accounts, he was considerate within the limits of his understanding. He ensured she was attended to, that physicians were consulted, that her dignity as empress was maintained. But he did not intervene. He did not question the relentless pregnancies. He did not challenge the pressure placed on her body. He did not slow the machine that was killing her. To Leopold, duty outweighed discomfort. The empire could not afford hesitation. A male heir was still desperately needed, and Margaret, frail as she was, remained the only viable means of securing one. The court shared this view. Margaret felt it in the way conversations shifted when she entered a room, in the way advisors spoke of her health as a logistical concern rather than a human one, in the way her suffering was acknowledged but never allowed to interfere with dynastic urgency. She was not pitied, she was managed. Isolation deepened. Margaret retreated further into the small circle of Spanish attendants who remained with her. They spoke her language. They remembered who she had been before Vienna reduced her to a function. With them, she allowed moments of vulnerability, quiet tears, whispered confessions of exhaustion, expressions of longing for Madrid. She missed Spain not just as a place, but as a time. There, she had still been someone's daughter. Here, she was only an empress, and an increasingly ineffective one. Her daughter, Maria Antonia, became her anchor. Margaret clung to the child fiercely, aware on some instinctive level that this might be the only lasting trace she would leave behind. The court allowed this closeness, viewing it as harmless sentiment. They did not recognize it for what it was, a mother holding on to the only proof she had ever existed beyond obligation. Vienna, meanwhile, moved on around her. Festivals continued. Music played. Court life adapted seamlessly to Margaret's fading presence. New faces arrived. New ambitions took shape. The empire did not slow for illness. Ambassadors reported back to their capitals with growing concern. The empress was unwell, frequently confined, emotionally withdrawn. Some speculated that she would not live long. These reports were not meant as warnings. They were assessments. Margaret Theresa sensed the quiet shift in how she was perceived. She was no longer the promising young bride, no longer the solution to dynastic anxiety. She was becoming a liability, a fragile figure whose failure would require contingency. And contingencies were already being discussed. She was only in her early 20s, yet her body felt decades older. Each breath required effort. Each day demanded endurance. She moved carefully, conserving energy, aware that even small exertions left her trembling. Vienna had not welcomed her as a home. It had consumed her as a resource. And as her strength ebbed, the court's patience thinned, not out of cruelty, but necessity. The dynasty could not afford to wait for recovery that might never come. Margaret Theresa had been brought to Vienna to secure the future. Instead, Vienna was watching her fade, quietly, efficiently, while preparing for what would come after her. Because the House of Habsburg had always believed that individuals were replaceable, and Margaret, worn thin by duty, was reaching the end of her usefulness. Margaret Theresa did not collapse all at once. She eroded. Her health failed in stages, each one small enough to be dismissed, but together impossible to ignore. What began as fatigue became weakness. What felt like weakness turned into pain, and pain, over time, became her constant state. By now, she was rarely seen outside her chambers. When she did appear, it was under strict control. Short walks through palace halls, carefully timed audiences, brief appearances at religious ceremonies where she could sit or lean unnoticed. The illusion of normalcy was maintained with effort and silence, but behind closed doors. Margaret was struggling to breathe, her enlarged thyroid pressed against her throat, making swallowing difficult. Her voice weakened. She suffered long bouts of fever and stomach pain that left her drenched in sweat. Barely conscious, physicians recorded symptoms they did not understand and prescribed treatments that did nothing. Sometimes they bled her. Sometimes they prayed. Nothing helped. Margaret endured these interventions quietly. She had learned long ago that resistance was pointless. Pain, like duty, was something to be absorbed without complaint. Pregnancy had destroyed what little resilience her body possessed. Even when she was not carrying a child, her body behaved as if it were constantly recovering from one. Her menstrual cycles were irregular and painful. She experienced dizziness so severe she sometimes collapsed while standing. Eating became difficult, sleep unreliable, and still. The possibility of another pregnancy hovered over her like a sentence not yet carried out. Leopold did not force her physically, but the expectation remained. The empire still lacked a secure male heir. Advisors continued to speak in careful language about hope and God's will, but the implication was unmistakable. Margaret understood. Her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the future Leopold needed, emotionally. She withdrew further each month. The lively girl once painted by Velázquez was now a memory even to herself. She spoke less, smiled rarely. Her energy was reserved almost entirely for her daughter, Maria Antonia, who clung to her with the instinctive fear of a child sensing loss. Margaret held her often, longer than was considered proper. She inhaled her scent, memorizing it. She watched her sleep. She whispered prayers not for dynastic success, but for survival. The child's, not her own. Vienna noticed. Whispers spread that the empress had grown melancholic, that grief had unbalanced her, that her weakness was partly emotional. These rumors were easier to accept than the truth, that centuries of inbreeding and relentless expectation had finally reached a breaking point. Margaret did not correct them. She no longer cared how she was perceived. Ambassadors continued to observe her condition with professional interest. Reports described her as frail, frequently indisposed, unlikely to recover fully. Some speculated openly about how long she might live. These assessments traveled faster than sympathy ever could. The court began to prepare quietly for the possibility of her death, not with mourning, but with logistics. Advisors discussed succession contingencies. The idea of Leopold remarrying was introduced carefully, framed as prudence rather than replacement. Margaret was not consulted. She sensed the shift anyway. People spoke around her now, not to her. Decisions happened without her presence. Her role as empress diminished as her physical strength faded. She was no longer central to court life. She was peripheral. Vienna had adapted to her illness. This realization settled heavily over Margaret. It was not fear of death that troubled her most. It was the understanding that even her suffering had failed to change anything. The system she had been raised to serve would continue, uninterrupted, with or without her. The dynasty did not pause for pain. Margaret's prayers changed in these final years. She no longer asked for strength or healing. She prayed for rest, for relief, for her daughter's future to be kinder than her own. She was only 21. Her body felt ancient. Each morning she woke uncertain whether she would have the strength to rise. Each night she slept lightly, disturbed by pain, by breathlessness, by the knowledge that something inside her was failing beyond repair. And still, the court waited for recovery that would not come, waited for a miracle that had already been exhausted, waited for an ending they did not wish to name aloud. Margaret Theresa lived each day suspended between expectation and exhaustion, her body under siege by the very bloodline she had been sacrificed to preserve. She had been born into power, raised into obedience, married into duty. Now, she was being worn down, quietly, relentlessly, by a life that had never allowed her to stop. And the end, though unspoken, was drawing closer with every labored breath. By early 1673, Margaret Theresa no longer spoke of the future, not because she feared it, but because she could no longer imagine herself in it. Her health had deteriorated beyond any illusion of recovery. Weeks passed where she never left her bed, even simple movements, turning her head, lifting her hands, left her breathless. The swollen gland at her throat had grown more pronounced, making speaking painful and eating difficult. The court stopped pretending she would improve. Physicians came and went with increasing frequency, their expressions carefully neutral. Their treatments grew more desperate. Some believed her illness was spiritual, not physical. Confessors were summoned as often as doctors. Prayers replaced medicine. Nothing changed. Margaret's chambers became a place of waiting, not the expectant waiting of childbirth or ceremony, but the heavy, suspended waiting of decline. Time stretched and slowed. Days blurred into one another, measured only by pain and exhaustion. She was 21 years old. Vienna's winter was harsh, and the cold seeped into her bones. Fires burned constantly in her chambers, but she remained chilled. Fevers came and went unpredictably. Her body could no longer regulate itself. For 3 weeks in early spring, she suffered severe stomach pains that left her unable to sleep. Then came the fever, high, persistent, draining what little strength she had left. Word spread quickly through the court. Ambassadors reported urgently. Advisors whispered in corridors. The question was no longer if Margaret would die, but when. Leopold was at her bedside more often now. His presence was solemn, restrained. He spoke to her gently, offering prayers and reassurance, but there was distance in his concern, an emperor confronting inevitability rather than a husband losing a wife. Margaret did not resent him. Resentment required energy she no longer possessed. Her thoughts turned inward, toward memory, toward Madrid, toward the Alcázar bathed in Spanish light, toward the sound of her brother's voice, confused but familiar, toward a childhood that felt impossibly far away. She held Maria Antonia whenever she could. The child sensed something was wrong. She clung to her mother desperately, crying when separated. Margaret gathered her close, whispering softly in Spanish, pressing kisses into her hair with what little strength remained. These moments were the last pieces of herself she could still claim. On March 10, 1673, Margaret's condition worsened dramatically. Breathing became labored. Her pulse weakened. Physicians quietly acknowledged what everyone already knew. A confessor was summoned. The sacrament of last rites was administered. Margaret listened, barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her body exhausted beyond repair. She did not resist. She did not panic. There was nothing left to fear. 2 days later. On March 12, 1673, Margaret Theresa of Spain died. She was 21. The court fell into formal mourning. Bells tolled. Black drapery filled the halls. The rituals of grief were performed with precision and decorum. But the most devastating truth emerged only after her death. An autopsy revealed that Margaret had been pregnant at the time she died. Another son, even in death. Her body had been serving the dynasty. She was buried in the imperial crypt in Vienna, far from the city of her birth, far from the palace that had shaped and sacrificed her. Funeral services stretched on for weeks. the empire honoring the role she had played more than the life she had lived. Leopold mourned her publicly, visibly shaken by her loss. By the end of the year, he remarried. The dynasty required continuation. Margaret Theresa's life ended quietly, without rebellion, without scandal, without resistance. She had done everything asked of her, and it had destroyed her. She had been born into a system that valued blood over life, legacy over humanity. Her death was not a tragedy to the dynasty. It was an inconvenience. What mattered now was what came next. Her only surviving child, Maria Antonia, inherited her claim to the Spanish throne. That claim would pass again, through death and inheritance, until it triggered one of Europe's most devastating conflicts. But Margaret would not live to see that. She would remain frozen in memory as the girl in the painting, the child at the center of Las Meninas, still, silent, perfect. History would remember her face. It would forget the cost. After Margaret Theresa's death, the Habsburg court did not stop. It reorganized. Black cloth covered the walls of Vienna. Bells tolled. Formal mourning stretched on for weeks, precise and ritualized. Prayers were offered for the soul of the young empress, whose life had ended before it had truly begun. And then, quietly, attention shifted to what remained. Maria Antonia. She was only 4 years old when her mother died, too young to understand death, but old enough to feel absence. She searched instinctively for Margaret in familiar rooms, clung to servants who smelled faintly of her mother, and cried when she was separated from the last traces of comfort she recognized, to the court. However, Maria Antonia was not an orphan. She was an asset. She was the only child of Margaret Theresa to survive infancy, and that fact alone made her extraordinary within the Habsburg lineage, where so many children had failed to live. She had endured. That endurance transformed her instantly into something far more important than a grieving child. She was a claim. Through her mother, Maria Antonia inherited rights to the Spanish throne, rights that now carried terrifying weight. Spain's king, Carlos II, Margaret's brother, remained alive but childless, his health deteriorating steadily. His inability to produce an heir was no longer merely a concern. It was a crisis. Europe watched Spain closely. The question of succession, who would rule after Carlos, had become one of the most dangerous uncertainties on the continent. And suddenly, Maria Antonia stood at the center of it. She was raised in Vienna, surrounded by caretakers, tutors, and guards who spoke softly but watched closely. Her upbringing was careful, controlled, and deeply political from the moment Margaret was buried. The court did not speak of her mother often. Margaret's suffering was not a story they wished to preserve. Instead, they framed her as a dutiful empress, a noble sacrifice, a necessary link in the chain of inheritance. The pain that had destroyed her body was reduced to footnotes. Maria Antonia would not be told that story. She was dressed beautifully, educated thoroughly, protected obsessively. Everything about her upbringing was designed to keep her alive and useful. Leopold I, now a widower, remained emotionally distant from the child. He did not mistreat her, but neither did he attach himself to her deeply. He understood, better than anyone, what Maria Antonia represented. She was not his legacy. She was Spain's future. Within months of Margaret's death, Leopold remarried. His new wife, Claudia Felicitas of Austria, was young, healthy, and, most importantly, capable of producing heirs. The court celebrated the match as prudent and necessary. Maria Antonia watched the transition with quiet confusion. The woman who had replaced her mother was kind, but distant. The routines of court resumed quickly, as if grief were a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent wound. The palace adapted, as it always did. Maria Antonia adapted with it. She grew into a solemn child, observant, reserved, and unusually composed for her age. Courtiers praised her maturity, unaware that it was rooted in loss rather than virtue. She carried her mother's legacy without knowing its cost. As the years passed, Spain's situation grew more unstable. Carlos II's health worsened. Rumors of his impending death circulated constantly. Foreign powers began maneuvering openly, preparing to claim the Spanish crown when it finally became vacant. France watched closely. Austria prepared defensively. Every major court in Europe calculated its position. And at the center of these calculations stood a child who had never set foot in Spain, Maria Antonia. She was too young to understand why ambassadors studied her face so intently, why her tutors emphasized lineage and inheritance, why her future was discussed in terms of claims rather than desires. But the pattern was familiar, like her mother before her. Maria Antonia was being shaped into a solution. Margaret Theresa's life had been consumed by the need to preserve a dynasty already decaying. Now, that same dynasty turned its attention to her daughter, hoping that this time the bloodline might endure. The Habsburgs had lost Margaret. They could not afford to lose her child. As Maria Antonia grew, the silence around her mother grew louder. The court of Vienna did not forbid mention of Margaret Theresa. It simply made remembering her unnecessary. Portraits remained on the walls. Prayers were said on anniversaries. But the truth of Margaret's suffering was carefully erased from daily life. What mattered now was not how Margaret had died, but what she had left behind. And Maria Antonia felt that weight long before she understood it. Her education was unusually intense for a child so young. Tutors emphasized history and lineage, drilling into her the names of kingdoms and the logic of inheritance. She learned early that crowns did not pass through affection or merit, but through blood, her blood. She was taught to sit still, to listen, to absorb. She was taught to be careful with her words. She was taught that attention was both a privilege and a danger. Courtiers watched her closely, noting similarities to her mother, her posture, her expression, the quiet seriousness in her eyes. Some found it comforting. Others found it unsettling. To them, she was a reminder. To Maria Antonia, it was simply life. She grew up knowing she was important without knowing why. She sensed that adults spoke around her rather than to her. That decisions were made in rooms she was not allowed to enter. That her presence altered conversations the moment she appeared. It was the same atmosphere Margaret had grown up in, only colder. Leopold V maintained a formal distance. He ensured Maria Antonia was well provided for, well educated, well protected. But emotional closeness was rare. His attention was now divided by his new marriage, by the demands of empire, by the constant pressure to secure male heirs of his own. Maria Antonia belonged to another future. That future grew more precarious with each passing year. In Spain, Carlos II continued to decline. His health deteriorated visibly. He remained childless. Despite multiple marriages, rumors of impotence, illness, and incapacity spread freely across Europe. Spain's vast empire stood on the brink of a succession crisis unlike any seen before. And everyone knew it. Diplomats began to speak openly of contingencies. Treaties were drafted in secret. Powers positioned themselves carefully, preparing to claim Spain's throne the moment it became vacant. Maria Antonia's name appeared more frequently in these discussions. She was young, she was legitimate, and through her mother, she carried a direct claim to Spain. The court of Vienna understood the danger. If Maria Antonia lived, she could become a focal point for rival claims, used, married, or eliminated depending on circumstance. Her survival was essential, but so was control over her future. The solution was familiar: marriage. Even before Maria Antonia reached adolescence, Her future was being negotiated. Potential matches were discussed quietly, weighed for political advantage rather than compatibility. Her childhood, like her mother's before her, began to narrow into preparation. She sensed it instinctively as she grew older. Maria Antonia became increasingly reserved. She asked few questions. She observed carefully. She learned to withhold her thoughts, understanding on some level that curiosity invited scrutiny. Loss had taught her caution. She rarely spoke of her mother, but when she did, it was with an intensity that startled those around her. She remembered Margaret not as an empress, but as warmth, hands holding hers, whispered prayers, a presence that made the world feel less threatening. Those memories became her refuge. The court, however, saw only opportunity. They spoke of Maria Antonia as a bridge between empires, a solution to Spain's looming collapse. Her value increased with every report of Carlos II's worsening health. She was no longer just a child who had survived. She was the hinge of Europe's future. Margaret Theresa had been sacrificed to preserve the Habsburg bloodline. Her daughter was now being positioned to determine its final fate. The pattern repeated itself with terrifying precision. Blood demanded continuity, power demanded obedience, and childhood was once again the price. Maria Antonia stood unknowingly at the center of forces far larger than herself, forces that had already destroyed her mother. History was closing in. By the time Maria Antonia reached her teenage years, the tension surrounding her was no longer subtle. It was constant. Every lesson, every appearance, every letter that arrived from abroad carried the same unspoken message. She mattered too much to be free. The court of Vienna watched her carefully, measuring her health, her temperament, her suitability. Physicians examined her with the same quiet intensity once reserved for her mother. Tutors corrected her relentlessly. Courtiers praised her composure, mistaking caution for maturity. She had learned early that survival depended on restraint. Maria Antonia understood more than anyone realized. She knew she was being shaped for something larger than herself. She did not yet know what form that future would take, but she recognized the pattern. She had seen it in the fragments left behind by her mother's life. The silence, the obedience, the absence of choice. History was not hiding from her. It was repeating itself. In Spain, the situation grew critical. Carlos II was visibly failing. His body, ravaged by generations of inbreeding, could no longer hide its fragility. He suffered from chronic illness, infertility, and mental decline. Despite multiple marriages, he produced no heir. The Spanish throne was becoming an open question, and Europe prepared to answer it with force if necessary. Every major power had a plan. France maneuvered aggressively. Austria guarded its position. Treaties were drafted, revised, and abandoned in secrecy. At the center of these calculations stood Maria Antonia. Her claim to Spain made her dangerous and desirable. Vienna knew it could not leave her future to chance. The longer she remained unbound, the greater the risk that another power would attempt to seize control of her claim through marriage or coercion. So the court acted. Maria Antonia was betrothed while still young, promised into another political union designed to stabilize Europe's balance of power. The match was framed as protection, as honor, as necessity. She accepted it quietly. There was no protest, no resistance. She had been raised too carefully for that, like her mother before her. She understood that refusal was not an option extended to girls like her, but fate, it seemed, had grown impatient with the Habsburgs. Maria Antonia's health, once considered promising, began to falter. She suffered frequent illnesses, weakness, and exhaustion that echoed the symptoms that had once consumed Margaret. The court noticed and panicked. They tightened their control, restricted her movements, increased medical supervision. The fear was not for her comfort, it was for her survival. Because if Maria Antonia died, the carefully balanced web of succession would unravel. And then, just as the court prepared to deploy her fully into the political arena, tragedy struck again. In 1692, Maria Antonia died. She was only in her early 20s. Her death was sudden, devastating, and profoundly destabilizing. The last living link between Margaret Theresa and the Spanish throne was gone. The solution the Habsburgs had spent decades preserving vanished overnight. The court mourned, but this time, panic followed grief. Maria Antonia's claim did not die with her. It passed to her infant son, Prince Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. The child became the next focal point of Europe's obsession, a living key to Spain's future. Once again, a child stood at the center of imperial ambition. Once again, survival became political. Joseph Ferdinand was raised under intense protection, guarded as though his life were a fragile treaty. Europe held its breath. If he lived, war might be avoided. If he died, chaos would follow. In 1699, he died. He was 6 years old. With his death, the last peaceful solution to Spain's succession vanished. The fragile agreements collapsed, alliances shattered, and Europe plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that would last nearly 15 years and claim countless lives. The war reshaped the continent, and it traced its origins back to a single bloodline, to marriages meant to preserve power, to children born into expectation, to lives sacrificed for continuity. Margaret Theresa did not live to see this catastrophe, but her life had set it in motion. She had been born as a solution. Her daughter had inherited that burden. Her grandson had died beneath it. The House of Habsburg had tried to outmaneuver nature, to bend blood and marriage into tools of control. Instead, it had hollowed itself out, generation by generation, until collapse was inevitable. Maria Antonia had tried to survive the role her mother never escaped. She failed, and with her death, the cost of centuries of obsession became impossible to ignore. The dynasty had consumed its children, and Europe would pay the price. Margaret Theresa's death did not end a story. It exposed a wound that had been festering for generations. In the months and years after her burial in the imperial crypt of Vienna, Europe continued as it always had. Courts convened, treaties shifted, wars threatened. On the surface, nothing seemed to pause for the loss of a young empress. But beneath that motion, something had broken. The Habsburg dynasty, once feared for its reach and permanence, was now visibly decaying. The illusion of control, the belief that marriage and blood alone could secure eternity, was collapsing under the weight of its own consequences, and nowhere was that decay more evident than in Spain. Carlos II, Margaret's brother, still sat on the Spanish throne, in theory. He was king of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. In reality, he was a man barely capable of governing his own body. By the 1670s, Carlos's condition had worsened dramatically. His jaw, malformed since birth, made speech difficult. His digestion was weak, his immune system fragile. Mentally, he fluctuated between clarity and confusion. He was deeply religious, increasingly paranoid, and painfully aware of his own limitations. Most devastating of all, he could not produce an heir. The Spanish court tried everything. Carlos was married and remarried. Physicians attempted treatments bordering on superstition. Priests performed exorcisms, convinced that dark forces, not genetics, were to blame. Nothing worked. The truth was unavoidable. The bloodline had reached its limit. Foreign powers understood this long before Spain was willing to admit it. France, Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic all watched closely, calculating what would happen when Carlos died. The Spanish Empire, its land, wealth, and influence, was too valuable to be left uncontested, and Margaret Theresa, though long dead, remained central to those calculations. Her marriage to Leopold had bound Spain and Austria together. Her daughter Maria Antonia had carried the most viable claim to the Spanish throne. Her grandson Joseph Ferdinand had briefly offered Europe a way out of war. All were gone. What remained was a vacuum. The absence of a clear successor turned Spain into a prize rather than a state. Diplomacy grew tense. Alliances hardened. Every major power prepared for the same outcome: conflict. Margaret's life, once framed as a sacrifice for stability, was now revealed as part of a much larger failure. She had been married to preserve the dynasty. Her body had been exhausted to produce heirs. Her suffering had been justified as necessary. And still, the dynasty stood on the brink of collapse. The Habsburgs had believed that by keeping power within the family, they could prevent chaos. Instead, they had ensured it. Generation after generation of inbreeding had weakened not only bodies, but judgment. Fear of losing control had driven them to decisions that made loss inevitable. In Vienna, Leopold I ruled on, older, more cautious, acutely aware of how close the empire had come to catastrophe. He remarried, produced children, and continued the Habsburg line on the Austrian side. But Spain was slipping away. Every negotiation failed. Every proposed compromise collapsed under suspicion. The memory of Margaret Theresa lingered in the background, not as a person, but as a reminder of what had been attempted and lost. She had been the bridge, and the bridge had collapsed. As Carlos II's health continued to fail, Europe edged closer to war. The Spanish throne, once secured by marriage and blood, now demanded armies. The quiet suffering of a young empress had rippled outward, shaping decisions made by kings and generals who would never know her name beyond titles and claims. Margaret Theresa had lived and died believing she was preserving something eternal. What followed her death proved the opposite. The empire she had been sacrificed for was already falling apart, and soon, the world would feel the impact of what the Habsburgs had done, not to their enemies, but to themselves. By the time Carlos II of Spain approached the end of his life, Europe was no longer asking who should inherit Spain. They were asking who would fight for it. The king's body had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. He was frail, childless, and painfully aware that his death would trigger chaos. His court was divided by fear and suspicion. Advisors whispered competing solutions into his ear, each backed by foreign powers eager to claim the largest empire in Europe. Spain was no longer sovereign. It was contested. France pressed its claim through bloodlines tied to the Bourbon dynasty. Austria asserted its own right through the Habsburg legacy. England and the Dutch Republic watched carefully, determined to prevent either power from becoming too dominant. Every argument traced itself back to inheritance. Every claim led back to marriage, and many of those marriages led back to Margaret Theresa. Her body had been used to secure continuity. Her daughter had been positioned as a solution. Her grandson had briefly become Europe's hope for peace. All of them were gone, with no clear successor left. The careful balance collapsed. Carlos Spain died in 1700. The moment his death was announced, treaties dissolved into irrelevance. Alliances hardened overnight. Europe prepared for war not out of ambition, but inevitability. The conflict that followed, the War of the Spanish Succession, would rage for nearly 15 years, It would stretch across continents, from Europe to the Americas. Hundreds of thousands would die, kingdoms would be reshaped, and it all began with a bloodline that could not let go of control. The war was not just about land, it was about legitimacy. Who had the right to rule Spain? Who carried the correct blood? Who could claim continuity without provoking collapse? These questions had haunted the Habsburgs for centuries. They had tried to answer them through incest, through forced marriages, through sacrificing daughters like Margaret Theresa in the belief that blood purity equaled stability. Instead, blood had become the fuse. The irony was devastating. The dynasty that had feared losing power to outsiders had weakened itself so thoroughly that outsiders now had no choice but to intervene. The attempt to preserve everything had left nothing defensible. Battles were fought in Margaret's name without anyone speaking it. Her marriage to Leopold had tied Austria to Spain. Her daughter's claim had shaped diplomatic treaties. Her grandson's death had erased the last peaceful option. Her body had been the starting point. Yet history would not remember her as a cause. It would remember her as a portrait, while armies clashed and empires burned. Margaret Theresa remained frozen in oil paint, forever young, composed, silent. The girl in Las Meninas watched history unravel, unmoving, unaware. The war eventually ended in 1714, not with triumph, but compromise. Spain lost much of its empire. The Habsburgs lost their grip. Europe emerged changed, more cautious, more fragmented, more aware of the limits of dynastic control. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. Blood could not guarantee stability. Marriage could not prevent decay. And no amount of sacrifice could save a system already collapsing from within. Margaret Theresa had lived believing she was necessary. History proved that she was consumed for nothing. The dynasty she was meant to protect did not endure unchanged. The empire she was meant to secure did not survive intact. The peace she was meant to guarantee arrived only after unimaginable violence. All that remained was the cost. A young woman dead at 21, a daughter dead before 30, a grandson dead before 7, and a continent scarred by war. This was the final inheritance of the House of Habsburg. Not glory, not permanence, but proof that power, when obsessed with itself, will destroy even its own children. When the cannons finally fell silent, Europe searched for meaning in the wreckage. Treaties were signed, borders redrawn, thrones stabilized, at least on paper. Historians would later argue over winners and losers, over which empire gained and which declined. But beneath those debates lay a quieter truth that rarely made it into official records. The catastrophe had not begun with armies. It had begun with children. The War of the Spanish Succession was often described as an unavoidable clash of great powers. Yet its roots were painfully intimate. Generations of forced marriages, compromised bodies, and lives reduced to vessels for legitimacy. At the center of that long chain stood Margaret Theresa of Spain. She did not start a war. She did not choose a side. She did not make a single political decision. And yet, her life and death shaped everything that followed. History preferred cleaner explanations. It spoke of treaties and diplomacy, of dynastic rights and balance of power. It did not dwell on the teenage girl shipped across Europe to marry her uncle. It did not linger on the pregnancies that broke her body. It did not emphasize that she died pregnant, still serving a dynasty that had already failed her. Those details were inconvenient. They revealed something uncomfortable, that the great structures of power rested on very small, very fragile human lives. The House of Habsburg had believed itself eternal. Its rulers spoke of divine favor, of destiny written in blood. They believed marriage could solve anything, rivalry, rebellion, even biology. Margaret Theresa was one of the last expressions of that belief. She had been raised carefully, obediently, and without illusion of choice. Her value was calculated from birth. Her childhood narrowed into preparation. Her marriage was arranged to preserve control. Her body was pushed beyond its limits in pursuit of heirs. And when she failed, when her body finally gave out, the system did not stop. It adapted. Her daughter was positioned next. Then, her grandson. Then, finally, armies. Only after tens of thousands were dead did Europe accept what Margaret's life had already proven. The strategy was broken. Blood could not be purified without consequence. Power could not be hoarded without decay. And dynasties that consumed their children would eventually consume themselves. Margaret Theresa's story rarely appears in history books as anything more than a footnote. An empress who died young. A face in a famous painting. Her suffering is softened, her role minimized, her humanity abstracted. It is easier to remember her as art. Las Meninas hangs in silence, admired for its technique, its mystery, its brilliance. Visitors study the composition, the mirror, the painter's gaze. They linger on the child at the center, calm, composed, untouched by time. Few ask what became of her. Few consider that the stillness in her eyes was not serenity, but conditioning, that the calm posture of a 5-year-old reflected a world already shaping her into something she would never escape. Margaret Theresa did not rebel. She did not resist. She did not break the rules. She followed them perfectly, and that is what destroyed her. By the time Europe learned the limits of dynastic obsession, it was too late for her, too late for her daughter, and too late for the generation that died fighting over what her body had once been meant to secure. The tragedy of Margaret Theresa is not that she died young. It is that she lived exactly as she was told to, and it still ended in collapse. Her life stands as a quiet indictment of a system that mistook obedience for stability and sacrifice for strength. History moved on, but if you look closely, past the crowns, past the treaties, past the wars, you can still see the truth it tried to bury. An empire did not fall because it lacked power. It fell because it destroyed its own children in the belief that blood was more important than life, and Margaret Theresa of Spain was one of the last to pay that price. Margaret Theresa of Spain did not leave behind memoirs. She did not record her thoughts. She did not shape how history would remember her. Others did that for her. When the dust of war settled and Europe reshaped itself in the early 18th century, Margaret existed only as a reference point, a link in a chain of claims, a marriage that once mattered, a portrait that endured. Her life was reduced to context. She became useful to historians, not human to them, and that reduction was deliberate. Empires prefer clean narratives. They favor causes and consequences that can be measured, treaties signed, battles fought, borders redrawn. A young woman slowly destroyed by duty does not fit neatly into that framework. So Margaret was remembered selectively. She was described as pious, as obedient, as delicate, as unfortunate, rarely as wronged. The official record framed her death as tragic but inevitable, her suffering as part of the cost of monarchy. The unspoken assumption was simple. This was how power worked. This was how it had always worked, but Margaret's life exposes something far more unsettling. She was not a victim of accident or illness alone. She was the product of design. Every major moment of her life, from her birth to her marriage to her death, was planned by others. Her parents' union was arranged to preserve blood purity. Her upbringing was shaped to prepare her for sacrifice. Her marriage was chosen to secure dynastic continuity. Even her pregnancies were not personal events. They were political milestones. Margaret did not fail the dynasty. The dynasty failed her. And yet, the system that destroyed her continued to justify itself long after she was gone. Leopold I remarried quickly. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. Austria produced heirs. Spain passed to a new dynasty. Europe stabilized. From the perspective of power, the sacrifice had been acceptable. That perspective is what history inherited. Margaret Theresa's individuality dissolved into symbolism. She became a warning without being acknowledged as one, a lesson learned only after irreparable damage had already been done. The irony is cruel. The House of Habsburg feared chaos more than anything. They believed strict control over bloodlines would prevent disorder, rebellion, and war. They believed personal suffering was a small price to pay for stability. Margaret's life proves the opposite. The attempt to control everything, marriage, inheritance, reproduction, did not create order. It created fragility. It weakened bodies. It narrowed options. It ensured that when collapse came, it would be total. Margaret Theresa did not live long enough to understand the role she had been forced to play in this unraveling. But her life tells the story clearly enough on its own. She was born into power without agency, raised into obedience without consent, married into duty without choice, and worked to death without acknowledgement. What survived her was not the dynasty she was meant to protect. What survived was her image. The girl in Las Meninas still stands at the center of the frame, surrounded by watchers, frozen in composure, her gaze directed outward. Viewers project meaning onto her eyes, curiosity, intelligence, serenity. But if history is honest, there is something else there. A child already aware that she is being watched, already learning stillness, already preparing to disappear. Margaret Theresa of Spain did not change the course of history by force or ambition. She changed it by being consumed by a system that could not see its own limits. Her legacy is not one of power. It is one of cost. And in that cost lies the final truth the Habsburgs never wanted to face. No empire is strong enough to survive if it treats its children as tools. If Margaret Theresa had lived an ordinary life, she might have been forgotten. Instead, she became immortal, not through words, not through legacy, but through art. Long after dynasties fell and borders shifted, her face remained, quietly observing from the canvas of Las Meninas. Visitors crossed oceans to stand before the painting. Scholars argued over its composition, its symbolism, its mystery, the mirror, the painter, the gaze, and always, at the center, the girl. Margaret Theresa became one of the most recognizable children in Western art history. Her image was studied endlessly, analyzed, praised, aestheticized. She was discussed as a symbol of royal innocence, of Baroque elegance, of Spain at the height of its power. Rarely was she discussed as a person. Art transformed her into something safer. A painting does not age. A painting does not suffer. A painting does not die in childbirth. By freezing Margaret in childhood, history avoided confronting what followed. The empress who faded in Vienna, the body worn down by pregnancies, the young woman who died pregnant at 21. The girl in the painting never reaches that moment. That is why she is remembered. Museums prefer stillness to decay. History prefers images to consequences. Las Meninas allows viewers to admire without responsibility, to be intrigued without being implicated, to appreciate beauty without asking what it cost. But when you place the painting back into the context of Margaret's life, it becomes something else entirely. It is not a celebration. It is a warning. The child at the center is not powerful because she is royal. She is powerful because everything in the room is already oriented around her, her body, her future, her usefulness. She does not dominate the scene. She is being prepared to be dominated by history. Velázquez may not have intended this meaning, but intention does not erase truth. The painting captured more than an image. It captured a system in motion. Servants attending, adults observing, authority reflected, not present. Even her parents appear only in a mirror. Margaret stands alone. That loneliness followed her through life. When she was sent to Vienna, the world she knew vanished. When she became empress, the person she was vanished with it. When she died, the dynasty mourned briefly and moved on. The painting, however, stayed, and because it stayed, it became easier to forget that Margaret Theresa was not an abstract idea, but a child who grew into pain, exhaustion, and silence. Art preserved her. History erased her suffering. This selective memory is not accidental. It reflects how power prefers to be remembered through symbols of grace and continuity, not through evidence of harm. Margaret's life disrupts that preference, because once you follow her story beyond the canvas, the painting becomes unbearable to look at without context. The composure in her posture no longer feels elegant. It feels learned, defensive, necessary. The stillness is no longer calm. It is training. Margaret Theresa did not choose to be art. She did not choose to be history. She did not choose to be a lesson, but she became all three. And in doing so, she exposes a pattern that extends far beyond the Habsburgs. Whenever power prioritizes legacy over life, children become instruments. Whenever obedience is praised over agency, suffering becomes invisible. Whenever sacrifice is normalized, collapse follows, quietly at first, then violently. Margaret's story is not unique. It is simply one of the most visible, because someone painted her before she was destroyed. The girl in Las Meninas still watches us, and if we are honest, her gaze asks a question history has tried to avoid. How many lives were made beautiful in memory only because they were unbearable in reality? Margaret Theresa of Spain never stood before a court to demand justice. She never accused her parents, never condemned the dynasty, never named what was done to her as cruelty. History would later do that instead, quietly, reluctantly, and far too late. By the time scholars began to fully understand the genetic consequences of Habsburg inbreeding, Margaret had already been dead for centuries. Medical historians traced patterns of deformity, infertility, immune failure, and early death through the family tree. What had once been dismissed as divine punishment or bad luck was finally recognized as something far more human. The dynasty had engineered its own decline. Margaret's body was not weak by accident. Her suffering was not mysterious. Her death was not unavoidable. It was predictable. She was born from a union of uncle and niece, married to another uncle, forced through repeated pregnancies before her body had fully matured, denied rest, choice, or recovery. No modern physician would be surprised by the outcome. Yet, in her time, this reality could not be acknowledged, because admitting it would mean admitting that the system itself was wrong. So instead, the dynasty blamed fate. They blamed God's will. They blamed fragility. Anything but themselves. Margaret Theresa's life stands today as a case study in what happens when power refuses limits, when tradition overrides biology, when legacy matters more than life. Her tragedy was not singular. She was one of many daughters, nieces, cousins, used to reinforce a collapsing structure. What makes her story endure is not that it was exceptional, but that it was documented so clearly. We know her face, we know her age, we know the exact dates her body failed. Most victims of dynastic obsession did not leave such a clear record. Margaret's story forces a reckoning, not only with the past, but with how history chooses what to remember. Empires celebrate conquerors, museums display crowns, textbooks track wars and treaties, but they rarely pause to ask, who paid for this stability? Whose bodies carried it? Whose lives were shortened so power could appear eternal? Margaret Theresa paid that price, and in the end, the payment was meaningless. The Spanish Habsburg line died with Carlos II. The empire fractured, Europe burned in war. The dynasty lost the very dominance it had tried to preserve. All that sacrifice for nothing. Margaret's obedience did not save Spain. Her marriage did not prevent war. Her death did not secure continuity. What survived was not the system, but the lesson, today. Margaret Theresa is remembered primarily through Las Meninas, a masterpiece admired for its complexity and beauty. But once you know her story, the painting becomes something else. It becomes evidence of how early she was shaped, of how young she was when stillness became necessary, of how completely her life was claimed before it had begun. She stands at the center of the frame, not because she held power, but because power surrounded her, watched her, prepared to use her. Margaret Theresa of Spain was not a ruler. She was raw material, and when she was used up, the world moved on. That is the final truth her life reveals. Not that monarchies are cruel, not that history is unfair, but that systems which demand sacrifice from the powerless will always fail, because they destroy the very people they depend on. Margaret never lived long enough to understand that truth. But we can. And if her story matters at all, it is not because she was royal, or beautiful, or painted by Velázquez. It matters because she was a human being, born into a system that mistook control for strength, obedience for virtue, and blood for destiny. She followed every rule, and the rules killed her. That is her legacy.